Gennady Golovkin versus Danny Jacobs fighting this weekend. I'm going to be really honest and say that this isn't a fight that I've been overly hyped for in the build-up, because I haven't seen it as necessarily a competitive fight. But if anything, that's credit to Triple G, because even though Golovkin has established an air of complete dominance over the middleweight division, this is still the definite number one middleweight in the world fighting a definite top three middleweight in the world. And I actually think it's the biggest test, certainly in terms of how highly the opponent is rated, of Golovkin's career to date. Danny Jacobs, for me, is probably either the number 2 or the number 3 middleweight in the division. There is an argument that Billy Joe Saunders should be placed above Danny Jacobs, which I know upsets a load of American fans, but I think Billy Joe Saunders has a greater strength in depth in terms of his resume than Danny Jacobs. I would say Danny Jacobs certainly has the biggest single win in Peter Quillen, but Billy Joe Saunders, with his wins against Andy Lee, Chris Eubank Jr., etc., and the amount of undefeated fighters Billy Joe's beaten, I think that Billy Joe could potentially merit that number 2 spot. But anyway, that's an aside and not necessarily what we're looking to talk about in this video. Danny Jacobs is the guy who, historically, I haven't been completely convinced about. I actually thought Peter Quillen would beat him. I thought Quillen would outbox him, and I thought Quillen may have too much power for him in their fight. But in that fight, Danny Jacobs showed why he is a very good fighter and why he's a threat in the middleweight division. Because he's a big guy, he comes out fast, he comes out aggressive, he looks to engage, and he does carry legit power. And that is really his angle in this fight, because I don't necessarily see him outboxing Triple G. And if you look at Danny Jacobs' resume, he's got the famous loss to Dmitry Pirog, and he's got bits and pieces of form. You know, he beat Ishe Smith, who I guess is a decent name. He beat Jared Fletcher. He beat Sergio Mora. Beat Peter Quillen. So, you know, he is a guy who is established at a reasonably high level in the sport. He's obviously got a great story with how he's come back from health problems and, you know, got to a world title level. He's also a relatively big guy. I think he's either 6 foot or 6'1". He carries legit power, and he's a bigger man than Golovkin. You know, I believe at the 30-day Czech weigh-in, he was just over the light heavyweight limit, and even at the 7-day weigh-in, he was just under the super middleweight limit. So Danny Jacobs is a big guy. He's going to be taller than Golovkin. I imagine on fight night he's going to be heavier than Golovkin. And, you know, at least there's sort of angles that you can refer to if you're in favour of Danny Jacobs. I think if I was advising Danny Jacobs in this fight, what he has got to do is avoid what happened to David Lemieux. You know, what he doesn't want to do is be closed out of this fight by Golovkin's outside boxing skills. And Golovkin's an interesting fighter, because Golovkin's a fighter who does generally seem to tailor his approach to different opponents. And that's actually quite rare in boxing. You know, you'd think it would be a given, but it's actually fairly few and far between that you see a fighter completely switch up their game. Yeah, we often see Golovkin as a pressure fighter, looking to walk opponents down and dig to the body. But against David Lemieux, he became an outside boxer. He became a jabber. He became someone who wanted to control the fight, you know, using his fundamentals. And I suspect that's what Golovkin is going to look to do against Danny Jacobs, because Danny Jacobs is a higher rated opponent than some of Golovkin's victims. He's a bigger guy, he hits harder. So I think Golovkin's going to adopt a safety first approach. I mean, no disrespect to guys like Kell Brook, but Kell Brook, you know, he was a welterweight. Danny Jacobs is probably going to be fighting at super middleweight in the future, whereas Kell Brook, you know, as we know, is stepping back down to welterweight. Guys like Dominic Wade, you know, just not the same level of operator. Guys like Martin Murray, you know, they're good fighters, don't get me wrong, I'm not discrediting them, but they don't have that power. And Danny Jacobs has that power, just like David Lemieux had that power. And we saw that when David Lemieux stopped Curtis Stevens in chilling fashion this week. So I'm afraid, I suspect, that Gennady Golovkin is probably going to adopt a more safety-first approach in this fight. And I actually think, from a Danny Jacobs perspective, He's got to go with a roll the dice kind of approach here, because if he can really stick it on Golovkin, yeah, we know Golovkin is a fighter who takes the odd shot in the ring, and you know, if Jacobs can do what he did to Peter Quillen, come out early, come out hard, catch Golovkin, there's at least a question there. You know, Golovkin's shown excellent discipline when he wants to. Golovkin's shown an excellent chin throughout his career. But what I'm getting at is, if I was in the corner for Danny Jacobs, I wouldn't necessarily be trying to outbox Golovkin. I wouldn't necessarily be trying to use my reach and out-jab the guy from range. I wouldn't necessarily try and adopt a back foot game and have Golovkin trying to walk me down and press me into the ropes. Instead, I'd be in sort of roll the dice territory from round one. Because if Jacobs can start fast, and if he can, you know, start landing on Golovkin straight away like he was able to do against Peter Quillen, there's at least an open question there. Jacobs is at least giving himself a chance, a puncher's chance in the fight. Whereas I don't really see him having much of a chance in a pure boxing game. I think the other dynamic in the fight is Jacobs, there is reason to question his punch resistance, isn't there? I mean, Jacobs, he's cutting a lot of weight for the fight, as we know. He was stopped by Dmitry Pirog earlier on in his career. He was dropped, in my opinion, relatively heavily by Sergio Mora. And Sergio Mora is, you know, known as a feather-fisted type character. So Jacobs, you know, Jacobs has punch resistance concerns against a guy like Golovkin, who has a devastating knockout streak and a ridiculously high knockout percentage. So I think if Jacobs, you know, just sits and waits and, you know, allows Golovkin into the fight, I think Golovkin's going to land on Jacobs inevitably. And I think when he does, there's reason to suspect that the fight could be over. So I almost think Jacobs has got to look to land his money punch in the first round. You know, he's got to almost adopt a first one to land gets knocked out approach. So I'm not suggesting that if he lands on Golovkin, he's going to knock Golovkin out necessarily, but I'm saying that's the kind of mentality he ought to bring to the fight. And I know that's pessimistic in the build-up to a fight if you're trying to advise a fighter, but sometimes there are levels which means your best chance is a puncher's chance. You do have a punch. Just go out, be aggressive, and at least make sure you get one shot off and buy yourself a lottery ticket. Because Danny Jacobs, I don't believe, is going to outbox Gennady Golovkin. Danny Jacobs, I don't believe, is going to live with Golovkin's power. So I think if he lets Golovkin into the fight and that sort of stuff, I'm afraid the fight is going against him. If he can come out swinging from the start and land something, at least it, you know, creates a question, you know, in my mind. As for Golovkin, for me, I expect him to stop Danny Jacobs. You know, you've probably heard that by the tactics that I'm trying to give Danny Jacobs of buying a lottery ticket. But I expect Golovkin to stop Danny Jacobs. I believe Golovkin has a large number of advantages in this fight, technically. And as I said, I think the punch resistance concerns for Danny Jacobs do not match up nicely for him when you consider the power of Gennady Golovkin. I think Golovkin, you know, he isn't getting any younger, and that's a fact. A lot of people believe he slipped against Kell Brook. They believe he was taking unnecessary punches. But then the Golovkin fans say that Golovkin was ill and say that Golovkin wanted to make a bit of a show of it because he was fighting someone who was so much smaller than him. I don't know. But Golovkin in that fight didn't look super quick, and he didn't look like he was, you know, he was certainly taking punches, let's put it that way. So I think if I was advising Golovkin, I would say go back to the David Lemieux fight. You know, be aware that Danny Jacobs is a guy whose biggest win actually came in the first round against Peter Quillen. Be switched on from the first second, establish the jab, and if you do that, you're going to find an opening and you're going to be able to take this guy out. The fight reminds me of Terence Crawford, Victor Postol. Not stylistically, but it's an occasion where I want to applaud the fight based on the fact it's two of the very, very top guys in the division fighting each other. But regardless of that, it's a fight that I struggle to view as competitive. And I don't really see how Danny Jacobs necessarily wins the fight, other than from the classic puncher's chance. But I want to know your thoughts. I know this is a fight that a lot of people across the pond are very keen on. I know Danny Jacobs has a fan base. I know that people think that I've underrated Danny Jacobs. So I want to know your thoughts. What tactics will Danny Jacobs be best served to using to beat Gennady Golovkin? I personally don't see it other than doing what he tried to do against Peter Quillen, starting fast, landing early, hitting Golovkin and hoping that you've got enough power. But what tactics do you think Jacobs can use his size to try and box and move here? Let me know your thoughts. Interested in having a discussion on this, so do use the comment section below. If you've enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, do take the time to subscribe. I just want to give a quick shout out to Gene Raffin, who asked me to discuss this topic as well. But yeah, many thanks for watching, guys.